Okay, let's just get this over with. Castlevania The Adventure was released on the Game Boy back in 1989, and thus was the series' first ever portable entry. And believe it or not, it is yet another universally disliked Castlevania game. Yes, we are 5 games into the series, and so far, only one of the games we have covered is universally liked. And it's the first game at that. I think it's safe to say that Castlevania had a bit of an identity crisis in its early years, what with the radically different Vampire Killer and Simon's Quest, alongside an arcade title. But let me tell you, I have a lot of very bad memories with this title. I first played it on the 2019 Anniversary Collection. I started it after I finished Simon's Quest. I know the collection puts it after Castlevania 4, but even back then, I was a stickler for playing games by a release date. So The Adventure was my next target. And my god, I remember hating it so fucking much that it quickly became what I consider to be one of my least favorite games of all time. Up to that point, I was going through these games without using save states, but Castlevania The Adventure just broke me. So after almost 3 hours of trying to finish its final level, I finally caved in and abused save states to finish it off. Which I'm hoping to not have to do this time around, to be more optimistic. Since then, I've played Vampire Killer and Haunted Castle, 2 pretty bad Castlevania games that came out before it, so maybe with that perspective, I could find some new value in The Adventure. Probably not, but hey, no harm in hoping. For this video, I'll be playing The Adventure on the Konami GB Collection Volume 1 released only in Europe back in 2000. God, I'm such a nerd. It featured a bunch of Konami's old Game Boy games, but now in color, making this the definitive version of these original games. Kinda sucks they didn't use this version for the 2019 collection, but I guess either they just didn't even know it existed, or they just couldn't edit the game out of the collection. And it would have been really weird if they had a collection within a collection. But anyways, this is Castlevania The Adventure for the Game Boy. God, even the logo is fucked up. The game's official title is Castlevania The Adventure, but the logo clearly says The Castlevania Adventure. Not sure how that mistake got made, but it sure does bother the ever-living crap out of me. The Adventure is notable in that it is the first title in the series not to feature Simon Belmont at all. Instead, it is a prequel taking us 100 years before the events of the first game, telling the tale of how Simon's ancestor, Christopher Belmont, defeated Dracula 100 years before the events of the first game. And while that may sound pretty cool, the issue with this story is that it is identical to the first game's plot in almost every way, with the only difference being that instead of starring Simon at 1691, it's Christopher at 1576. And it's not like Christopher has any defining character traits that set him apart from Simon, he is just another blank slate whip-wielding Belmont, so sadly, this is kind of just a filler plot. And while it is not necessarily bad, I would have personally preferred even a little bit more out of it to set it apart. Visually, this is a Game Boy game, which is the weakest piece of hardware any Castlevania game has ever been on, so naturally, this is the worst looking game in the series yet. Even with the Game Boy Color update, which does add a lot more life to it, it is still not the most pleasant to look at nowadays, as it still very much feels like a Game Boy game with added color, rather than being made with colors in mind. The game is about as zoomed in as Haunted Castle was, while also having less visual fidelity than the original Castlevania. If it ended there, then I would have been fine with calling The Adventure a decent looking Game Boy game. But while the game looks fine at a still, when in motion it becomes absolutely hideous. This engine just feels unfinished. This game feels like it's running at 15 frames per second, and drops to 5 whenever there's like 3 stuff on screen at once. It is nigh unplayable. I know the Game Boy is pretty weak, but there are Game Boy games that both look and run far better than this. So I could only really assume that all of these issues are just due to poor programming. And what makes the frame rate even worse are the absolutely terrible controls. The game itself, on the surface, plays like all of the earlier games. You know the drill. Block jumps, whip delays, massive knockback. But then you start moving around, and you start wondering when everything started going wrong, because my god, the controls in this game are so bad. It feels like you're slugging through mud throughout the whole thing. You know how when Sonic gets underwater, he becomes a lot slower and harder to control? Well, that's basically how the entirety of Castlevania The Adventure feels. The jumping is also completely off. It feels like you're just picking up momentum at random when you're in midair sometimes, and the controls, combined with the horrible framerate, completely kills almost any amount of fun I could have had while playing the game. Usually, this is where the music would help pick up the slack, but I'm sorry to say that the OST didn't really click with me this time around. It's not bad, but it is by far the weakest of the soundtracks we've looked at so far. The only track I really remember is Battle of the Holy, the theme of the first stage, which is a pretty good one, not gonna lie. But the rest of the OST is just kind of a blur to me. Which is a shame, since this is a Castlevania game, and up until now all of these games had wonderful soundtracks. So it kinda sucks to say that this one is just okay to me. I guess I find it funny that the boss theme is called KILL! 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 But that doesn't really save it from just being a 20-second long loop, now does it? The game includes 4 levels, and while that is less than any of the other games, the levels themselves are far longer than those of the other games, often going on for over 6 minutes each. And that's not including any potential deaths, that will more than likely occur. Sadly, checkpoints within levels are pretty rare, so dying often means having to redo a lot of stuff. But luckily, the adventure has unlimited continues, thank fucking god. That means you can game over as much as you want, and won't have to start the whole game again. I can't believe Vampire Killer and Haunted Castle didn't have this. Most of the game doesn't even take place in Dracula's castle, only the last level does. And is it just me, or does this game give out some pretty strong Indiana Jones vibes? Like, instead of stairs, the game has you climbing ropes to get to higher platforms, which I wouldn't have minded if the game let you attack when climbing them, because as it is, you are completely vulnerable when doing so. But anyways, you go on to explore forests, caves, until you eventually get to an underground area full of spiked traps that you have to quickly maneuver through before they crush you. And combined with your main weapon once again being a whip, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the main inspiration was Indiana Jones this time around, which does give the adventure a pretty unique vibe, for as much as a vibe as a Game Boy game can have, I guess. But the thing that just pushed the adventure above and beyond into being one of my least favorite games of all time back when I first played it was the horrible level design, and more specifically, the final stage. So let's get on to that. The first stage starts out pretty simple, nothing bad but nothing mind-blowing, but then you get to this part where they ask you to pull off a bunch of near-frame perfect jumps with this game's horrible controls. I mean, just look at this. Does this seem like interesting level design? Just a bunch of arbitrary jumps you have to make with no interesting gimmick or alteration. It also introduces these platforms that fall as soon as you step on them, which again, do not mix well with this game's physics at all. Stage 2 is a bit of a mixed bag for me. It does have a few sorta cool sections like this bridge part with the eyeball enemies, which explode and destroy a part of the bridge when you kill them, meaning you have to be careful with your actions. But it also has parts like the stupid maze section, which is just a bunch of annoying trial and error. So overall, I'm left more so negative on this place too. But then we have fucking Stage 3, one of the series' most brutal sections yet. It starts off with this rising and lowering spiked ceiling, which just kinda requires you to wait for a while in order to pass it. But it isn't too bad. But then it has you climbing up as the spiked floor rises. This part is extremely strict, and while it wouldn't have been too bad in some of the other games, with the adventure's controls and framerate, it's just a frustrating mess. I did get pretty lucky going through it, but it was just too nerve-wracking for its own good. Then the rest of the stage has you dodging spikes coming from the right, which is thankfully a lot more manageable. Another unfortunate limitation of this being a Game Boy game is that the adventure doesn't have any sub-weapons whatsoever. Yes, they're gone, despite being a series staple, and I'm honestly not even sure why. I mean, the original Game Boy wasn't that weak. I'm sure it could have handled sub-weapons if they tried to put them in, since not having them definitely makes the game less interesting. There are still breakable candles everywhere, but as for the items they give you, well, there are the standard score increasing items that I once again don't really care for, You could also occasionally find this cross item that will make Christopher invincible for a short period of time, kinda like the laurels from Simon's Quest, though I only ever found them in the first half of the game, so that kinda stinks. The hearts are back, but because there are no sub-weapons, they just restore your health, which is extremely off-putting. I know hearts are used to represent health in most other games, but Castlevania always used them as ammo, while food was the thing that restored your health. But it does mean that health recovery items are far more common in the adventure, which is helpful for sure. But I guess this was done because the adventure doesn't have any breakable walls with meat, just like Haunted Castle. There are a few secret walls you can go through, which kinda carried me near the end of the game, with how useful the items you can find in them are, but I only found 2 of them in the entire game. Maybe there are more I didn't find though, who knows, probably Google. And finally, let's talk about the goddamn whip upgrades. Like in the previous games, your first upgrade is the chain whip, but instead of making it longer or replacing it with a random sword, the adventure instead lets you shoot fireballs out of your whip for your second upgrade, which is pretty cool, if potentially game breaking. The fireballs do act as a pretty nice compromise to not having sub-weapons, as they definitely don't do as much damage as the regular whip does, and some enemies are downright immune to them. So you can think of the fireballs as a sort of infinite version of the knife sub-weapon. But, here is the thing that ruins it all. Every time you get hit in the adventure, no matter what, your whip gets downgraded. I hate this so much. It is such an artificially bullshit way of making the game harder. You know, I get that the fireballs are pretty strong, and it might kinda break the game if you had them for most of it. But the regular chain whip? That was always one of the most important upgrades in the earlier games, and without it, you are pretty much screwed in most combat situations. And I mean, the adventure does have some pretty cool new enemies, like these Night Stalker guys, who are kind of like a more advanced version of the Axe Knights, throwing their projectile from either above or below. But before coming back to them, it switches altitudes, meaning you can't just duck and attack them in order to win. These definitely make for some pretty fun battles, not gonna lie. The Punaguchis would also be pretty cool, if it wasn't for the fact that they make the game lag like crazy every time they show their ugly faces. But again, the whip downgrading after getting hit just makes most of these encounters drag, and ruins what would otherwise be a pretty great roster of enemies. Oh, and they also respawn every time you go away and come back to their spawn points, and for enemies that push you back a lot like the Gobens, it can get pretty annoying. Look, I get why they added the whip downgrading. The adventure is a pretty short game, even for Castlevania standards, so they needed to make it harder to increase the average playtime. But, and I'm sure this is self-explanatory, I would take a good 1 hour long game over a bad 8 hour long game any day of the week. The price point doesn't matter, as long as I'm getting a quality product. And sadly, many other games fall into the spit of artificially increasing the difficulty just to increase the length, which is a shame. Most of the bosses are pretty forgettable. The first boss is just this regular knight guy who gets demoted to a regular enemy later on. Sucks for him, I guess. The second boss is pretty cool. These little creatures keep coming out of these holes, and you have to defeat them before it gets too hectic. It's kinda like Whack-A-Mole, and I like me a good round of Whack-A-Mole, so it definitely gets a pass from me. The third boss is this Despised guy, who is so pathetically easy I completely forgot he even existed and had to look him up before writing this section. You deserved better, Mr. Bird Guy, and I, for one, salute you. Weirdly enough, when you get to the boss arenas, you always have to hit a candle and then get an orb to make them show up. Another strange hardware limitation for sure. But now, let's talk about the adventure's final level. God have mercy. I am just going to be blunt here. This might be the absolute worst level in Castlevania history. It has a lot of individual parts that aren't too bad, but when put together, just create an absolute Frankenstein creature mess of a challenge. Not only does it have some long roads that just throw out some of the game's toughest enemies at you, but it also has the absolute most ridiculous jumps in the series yet, that were clearly not designed with this control scheme in mind. You make one mistake, and you're dead. And all of this terrible level design would be one thing, but combined with all of the absolute bullshit this game throws at you, and the messy unfinished engine, I hope it is clear why it is so universally hated nowadays. This level ends with the final battle against Dracula, in this battle arena right out of a Kaiser ROM hack. The first phase has him teleporting around shooting projectiles everywhere, and in the second phase, he turns into a giant bat, and shoots out small bats from his mouth, kinda like the final boss in Vampire Killer. I remember this fight being really hard on my first playthrough, but coming back to it now, it honestly wasn't too bad, as he is pretty easy to exploit and rack up a ton of damage on. The issue is that he suffers from what Vampire Killer's final boss suffered from, and that is that if you get a game over to him, you have to go through the long, brutal final stage again. In my first playthrough, I tried to beat this stage for hours and hours, but eventually just gave up and used save states, like I said earlier. But during this playthrough, I was determined to finish this content fair and square. And you know what? I fucking did it! And it only took me 1 hour. The main thing that helped me pull this off was the secret room I found near the end of the stage, which gives you a full health refill, a whip upgrade, and an extra life, which saved my ass tenfold. But yeah, after you kill Dracula, you watch over as Castlevania crumbles, just like in the first game. What a unique epic. But unlike the first game, after the credits, you get to see a bat escaping the destroyed castle, hinting that Dracula is still alive, and will come back to take revenge on Christopher. You know, for apparently only coming back once every 100 years, Dracula sure does stay around for a lot longer than you'd think he would in these scenarios. But anyways, that was Castlevania The Adventure. And yeah, I hated it. But to be honest, not as much as I used to. Don't get me wrong, it is still an awful game, and its engine was clearly unfinished and just rushed out of the window. But I do think it also has a few solid ideas from time to time. And for whether I liked it more or less than Vampire Killer, well, that's a tough one. While Vampire Killer has the far better controls, visuals, and is overall more unique, I honestly think I'll have to give the upper edge to The Adventure, but only by a tiny sliver, as, for one, the gameplay structure is a lot more solid in The Adventure, even if it's just because it borrows it from the first game, and secondly, The Adventure has unlimited continues, which as I said earlier, is a fucking godsend, coming from Vampire Killer and Haunted Castle not having them. Though I'd still put Haunted Castle above The Adventure, mostly for it having better controls, and the incredible OST. But don't get me wrong here, all of these games suck. And I still think the only Castlevania game we have looked at so far that I could confidently say is good would be the first one, with Simon's Quest being just okay, which is a great shame, since the series clearly has a lot of potential. But luckily, I feel pretty confident with saying that the worst is far behind us, as next time, we will be looking at Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. See you all then.